So our host today, who I'm excited to introduce you to, is Ellie Thompson from, she's the Communications Officer at Diversity and Ability. So they're an award-winning social enterprise focusing on how to pave the way and see a future where everyone and work is welcomed for everyone and inclusive. And Ellie specifically focuses on the communications for the business. And this session is going to be really interesting as a way of looking at how every business, even if we're small businesses, can be doing something in terms of communications to be more inclusive. So very kind of practical insights of what we can do to make a difference in our businesses. So I'm going to leave it there, Ellie, and hand over to you to introduce yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. That's such a well said introduction. Hopefully I can live up to that and show you, most importantly, exactly as you said, Sarah, exactly why this is important for everyone to do, and also why it's so kind of easy and simple and can have such a massive impact as well. So I'll just get my screen sharing on. Perfect. Lovely. So yeah, that was a great kind of introduction to the session and to what we do at DNA as well. So as Sarah said, my name's Ellie. I'm the Communications Officer at Diversity and Ability, and I'm also one of our workshop facilitators. And this workshop we're doing here today is one of my favourite kind of pieces of content to deliver, because it's all about quick fixes that are really accessible to us as small businesses or charities or social enterprises, as well as being accessible to our audiences. So it's really a properly win-win situation, which is why I get so excited talking about it as well. And we offer a lot of amazing things that I'm going to talk through in a little bit more detail at the end, and once I've kind of shown you why this is important and how it can make a difference. We started off delivering one-to-one training and have since expanded over the past 10 years to offer a range of different things, all focused on that same idea that diversity and inclusion should be completely central to everything we do, to all our business decisions, the way we run our organizations, the way we interact with each other, and just the way we kind of move through the world. Everything we do kind of goes under there. And that's why this workshop today, that's what we'll be covering as well. Just a few kind of helpful housekeeping things. I know we've already gone over the kind of normal Zoom muting rules. If you do have anything to contribute throughout, that's for anyone, please do feel free. I'll be asking questions throughout. My favourite way that these sessions go are when people do feel able to contribute and to write their responses or questions or comments in the chat as we go through. But there's no pressure to do so. It's completely up to kind of what works best for you and your learning style. I'm also really happy to answer any questions whenever. So whether that's at the end of the session today or over email after the session. As I've hopefully made clear already, this is something I really love talking about, so I'm always happy to talk about it more. And then just in terms of really kind of practicing what we preach, I'm a disabled and neurodiverse person myself. At Diversity and Ability, 85% of us are disabled and neurodiverse, so we're a really disability-led organisation. In terms of the session today, my lung capacity is rubbish, so bear with me if I get out of breath, if my voice cracks a little bit. It's all just symptoms of my disability. And similarly, if I forget my words, that's just my neurodiversity manifesting for you all perfectly to make it a really interactive and immersive session for you all. So just bear with me if any of that happens. And in terms of what we'll be discussing today, so really first we're going to talk through the general principles for inclusive communications, what we kind of mean by inclusive communications, and who we're potentially excluding with what we're doing at the moment in terms of our communication style, our marketing and our content. And we'll go through the specifics in terms of visual accessibility, audio accessibility, and then any quick fixes that you can do to make different aspects of your communications a lot more accessible and reach a massively more diverse and exciting audience as well. And we'll then discuss how you can put those principles into practice. So we'll discuss what this is going to look like for you on different social media platforms or on your website, and how you can kind of really put talk into action immediately. And then I'll share some final thoughts, and if there are any questions, I'm really happy to discuss them now as well. So we're going to start with visual accessibility. So this is a post for our Instagram, which I hate. So we're going to work on it a little bit, and we're going to improve it to make it more visually accessible. So what's the first thing that we can do in terms of making this more accessible? I'm going to ask our audience to have a think if they can see anything wrong with it.
I would say the color of the text, it's really hard to read.
Yeah, absolutely, definitely. That's perfectly segueing into my first point, actually, which is about the contrast and the color contrast on posts as well. So we really want to make sure that there is as big a contrast as possible between the background and the foreground of our text. As a general rule, if you think about opposite ends of the color wheel, or if you get a color wheel up in front of you and kind of visualize that, that's a really good place to start. But there are also amazing tools available on the internet in terms of really quick and easy contrast checkers. So there's one called Accessible Colors, there's one called Contrast Checkers. I'll make sure we have links to all of these so that you can really easily find and check all of your posts. And that means that for a lot of neurodiverse people who might find a real barrier in reading the content of this, I think the way I've created it it's pretty inaccessible for pretty much everyone. Already this is a little bit clearer, but it's not perfect. So for our next step, what we're going to do is work on an accessible font. So an accessible font, there's a couple of kind of key criteria that you're looking for. Firstly, you're looking for a sans serif font, which means one that's kind of less, so Times New Roman is a good example, where it has kind of the little flares on the end of each side of the letter. We don't want one like that. There's several reasons why. It's not kind of how we write naturally. So for a lot of neurodiverse people, that translates poorly and means that it's just not accessible to kind of read on a screen. Also, if anyone's using a magnifying tool or a zoom tool, so someone who's, for example, blind or sight impaired or vision impaired, when you zoom in on a text like that, the letters really blur together. So sans serif is a great start. We want the font to be at least 12 point, if not larger, again, so that everyone can read it and it's nice and clear. In terms of kind of the best fonts to use, we definitely want them to be really evenly spaced as well. And rather than written in script, we want it to be nice, evenly spaced gaps between each letters. So you can kind of see this example here. One of our favorites was created by Mencat and is called FS Me Regular. But anything like Arial or Calibri works fine as well. You don't have to kind of purchase specific fonts. You've already made a massive difference if you kind of use those basic instructions. There's a few extra things that we can do though to make this a more inclusive and accessible post. So this post here is what we actually posted on our Instagram. And we've added two extra things here. So firstly, the content is really clearly described. So with the last post, we're trying to kind of, I guess the aim is trying to be short and sweet, but what we've done is made it inaccessible. We've excluded people who need that additional content, who need the full sentences to understand what we're talking about. And then also adding numbers, so making your content in a list format immediately takes it up a whole level in terms of accessibility. Our eye knows where to go next. We can really clearly follow the steps, and that's going to really massively increase the audience of people who are going to be able to understand and appreciate the content that you're putting out there. Those are my first kind of quick tips. And next, we're going to talk about image descriptions and alt text, which is something that is getting talked about more, which is really exciting to see. Basically, I'll describe both of those terms first. So in general, what we're talking about with image descriptions and alt text is a description of the image for someone who is, for example, blind or sight impaired, so that they can understand the content of an image when they can't see the image. Image descriptions and alt text actually have a far wider range of uses. For a lot of neurodiverse people, for example, autistic people, it can be really useful to have the content written out, so you have a different way of processing the material. As we're all going to come on to, it will mean you'll explain things like facial expressions in a different way, which can be really helpful for including everyone in your post as well. And when we talk about image descriptions, we're talking about really clear written out description of the post. Alt text is a more kind of behind the scenes technique where you can have inbuilt alternative text behind your images, so that anyone with a screen reader, while progressing through their Twitter feed or their Instagram feed, will be read out the content of the post. Both are really useful to use in tandem, I would say. So your first kind of instruction with image descriptions is to just be really clear and descriptive. It can be really overwhelming actually to think about where to start in writing a good image description. The key is to really focus on the subject of the image first, then think about the object of the image, and then think about the content, the context. So that's what we mean by order by importance of the information as well. So we're starting by what our eyes naturally go to first, which is the real key point of the image. We're moving on to what's happening in the image, and then any contextual information as well. Image descriptions do also vary depending on the platform we're using. So for example, if you were writing quite a formal document with lots of kind of procedural information, you may include some images as a descriptive technique, which is a great thing to do for accessibility purposes. But if that image is purely descriptive, or it doesn't add anything separate to the text, in that context, you don't necessarily need to provide an image description. If it is purely descriptive or purely decorative, instead of descriptive, then you can leave that completely blank. You don't need to write an alt text. For social media, however, our social media posts are massively enriched by the uses of images, and we want to make sure that that's the case for everyone who comes across our social media, not just people who see the content. Especially for a platform like Instagram, which we know is set up to be a visual platform, we don't want to exclude users of screen readers from that experience. So our images can be really descriptive. A quick tip, which is really useful to know in terms of the image content, is to avoid words related to sites. This is, again, a really easy one to slip into in saying a tree is visible in the background, or you can see a man in the center of the screen. And that kind of language is really jarring for a blind or vision impaired person. It's really easy to think about alternatives, so just keep that in your mind when you're creating your image descriptions. Also, describing facial expressions can be really, really useful and really make a difference to the post. So really kind of getting that context in of what's going on in the photo. And that's also something that makes image descriptions a really great accessibility tool for such a wide range of people, not just those who rely on screen readers completely. In terms of how to actually add alt text to your social media posts, I could run through it here. It would be very long and not the most interesting thing to watch, and also not the best way for you to kind of understand that information. So we've prepared a guide to adding alt text to each of the different social media platforms. So it's linked there, and you can see the link there. I'll also link it in the description of the video, so that you can access that whenever you need and have that as a reminder to look back on as well. So we've got an example here of an image description. Another point that I'd really like to make is in making your image descriptions representative. So we know how important it is for our images to be diverse and representative of the kind of like diverse makeup of our society as well. So for that reason, it's actually really relevant to include any known descriptors for race, heritage, and gender. And the key thing to stress there is to not assume any of that information. So only provide it if you know. For example, this is our CEO, Atif. He identifies as a brown man. So I'll happily put that in the image descriptions for our posts. If I'm posting about a group of people, I don't necessarily know their gender or their race, it's totally fine to leave that out. Make sure you just write neutral language such as a person. But if you do know that information, it's really useful to share so that everyone who's accessing the post gets that richness of information that those who view the image get as well. Next, audio accessibility. So I've kind of done this as a sliding scale in terms of what's best to do. So at the bare minimum, make sure that you're really focusing on the background noise in your content. I think especially over the past year, we've all been kind of just dealing with the cards we've been dealt and trying to make the most of, I mean, none of us are working from kind of video studios with perfect sound setups and noise cancelling and the perfect headphones and microphone setups, but really do think about the background noise. If it's helpful, it's really worth recording yourself speaking, like a quick audio clip, even on just your phone or your laptop, to hear what it sounds like and realizing how those background noises can play into it. I'd say it's also really important in this to think about if you're using background music. So any kind of confusion in terms of multiple sensory kind of input can make that content really inaccessible. So really do think about minimizing the use of music or making sure that the music is really quiet so the audio comes across nice and clearly. That also really links on nicely to the next point, which is about creating transcripts for audio content. So for example, if you were going to create a podcast, it's really useful to have a transcript for that. And this is definitely another one of those win-win situations, because having a transcript for your podcast, in terms of kind of search engine optimization and getting really good keywords out there, getting the content of your podcast out there, you're having a literal written script of all the amazing things that were said. So that's just good to have anyway, even if it weren't the case that that's massively increasing the audience, the potential audience for your content. And there's a really good tool called Otter AI, which I love to use for transcripts. And there is a free platform which is quite limited, but then they've got a sliding scale in terms of subscriptions after that point. And it does really accurate recording and transcribing. It even does kind of detects different voices that are speaking and puts people as speaker one, speaker two. So for podcasts, for small organizations like us, that's just an absolute godsend. That really makes it kind of a possible and accessible step as well. If you're posting live content that can't necessarily be captioned at the time, then make sure that you upload it after the event with live captions. For this, I really think the best tool for organizations like us who don't necessarily have a team of communications people who can sit and manually transcribe, the YouTube automated captions is your best friend. It creates a fairly accurate captioning service for your videos, and you can use that as a great jumping off point. So all you need to do is edit that and refine it, add names where it's relevant, rather than having to kind of start from scratch. Instagram TV also has live captioning. So again, it's a great choice if you're making content that you want to push out there on Instagram. You can make sure that you activate the automated captioning on there, and you've got a really much more inclusive and accessible kind of array of video content. So as well as these kind of tips in terms of things that we can practically do, there's also more of a culture shift involved in thinking about the language that we're using. As I've hopefully made clear, we're really passionate about disability and neurodiversity and removing the barriers that make us disabled, the disabling barriers in society. And for that reason, make sure that you refer to disabled people as such, rather than using language like people with disabilities. That is widely preferred in terms of enabling language for us. Also for the deaf community, you can use deaf and hard of hearing. It's really important to write all three of those things, because then you're making sure that everyone who identifies feels included in your content. Also, as I've said, enabling is the absolute key. So making sure that you're removing any kind of negatively loaded words such as suffers from or struggles with, and use the positive framed language that we've talked about already. A kind of higher level, which is really important, is really thinking about the words that you're using and where they come from. And words like crazy, lame, mad, are all slurs that come with a really complex and often traumatic backstory for disabled people. If you can remove those words from your vocabulary, and especially from the communications content you're creating, you're removing an exclusionary barrier for a whole load of people and doing something really positive. Analogies for the same reason. So in general, it's best to avoid analogies. I know that can be quite a challenge because they're so built into the language that we use. But analogies for people who have English as a second language or who focus on a really literal kind of understanding of our words. So for example, a lot of neurodiverse people, autistic people, an analogy can be really jarring and instantly exclude them from your communications. And then there's also the case that a lot of analogies, when you really think about them, have a really traumatic and problematic backstory to them. So anything where you're talking about being crippling, blind leading the blind, falling on deaf ears, these are all negative connotations rather than saying the words we actually mean. And that's the kind of thing that creates this kind of exclusionary society. And we can really be kind of change makers in leading away from that and using the language that includes everyone. Surprisingly, the government's tips on this are actually really, really useful and really reliable. And they're not perfect, but they're a great place to start in kind of thinking about if the words you're using are inclusive. So there's a UK government guide on writing about ethnicity, so for kind of race and ethnicity characteristics. And there's also one on inclusive language. So if you Google government inclusive language or writing about ethnicity, you'll find those. But again, I'll add them to the many useful links below the videos. They're right there for you to access when you need. This is another one of my absolute favorites because it's so simple, and this is camel case. So as you can kind of see in the top situation, I mean, there's not much of a difference between the two cases. The only thing that we've done is use camel case, which means capitalizing the first letter of every word. So by doing that, we've meant that the words distinguish from each other for people who find reading a barrier, especially when it's kind of written in a slightly more confusing way or ambiguous way. And then also for screen readers. So if you write your disabled students allowance with capital D, S and A screen reader should read that out as disabled students allowance, rather than making up some words in the middle like sal or sallow. One I saw recently which just shows how quick a fix and how kind of damaging it can be to not do this is the hashtag Black Lives Matter without any capital letters, without camel case, reads as Black Lives or Lives Matter. So we're just instantly kind of blocking a load of people from understanding really important posts and that. Not every post is going to be like that, but this is a really, really quick fix that you can make to improve your content. Next up, we have descriptive link text. So which one do you think is more accessible here? So we've got a click here to read about our company, and we've got a to learn more about our company, read about us. So you can have a think about which one you think might be more accessible.
Maybe click here.
It's actually the second one. So this is definitely one of those cases where that really evidence the point that there is no kind of perfect answer for accessibility. There are some people for whom reading click here creates a really clear signal of where they need to go. If you're accessing this on a screen reader, what will happen is it will say click here, link to read about our company. And when you hear link, you know that that's what you press to access the link. But when it says click here, link, you don't yet know what the link is actually for. Whereas to learn more about our company, read about us, link, creates a really clear sign. You know what you're clicking on, you know where you're going. So it's a really accessible way of making that really simple shift. And also make sure you use a big color contrast between your link text and your general text. That's another way to really highlight the links and make sure that everyone can feel that that's an accessible option and know where they're going to head and what they're going to do when they get there.
Edit. Tweets clapping hand sign, written clapping hand sign, like clapping hand sign, this clapping hand sign, or clapping hand sign, not clapping hand sign, accessible clapping hand sign.
Sorry for that really irritating clip, but that is exactly what it sounds like when emojis are used throughout social media posts. So a little bit of a throwback in terms of kind of content here with the clapping hands emoji kind of meme that was going around a while ago. But every single tweet on your timeline would sound like that. And as you probably could tell, even from that video, you completely lose the meaning of the tweet. And in fact, for a lot of people, Twitter just became a completely inaccessible place while that was happening. So emojis should be used sparingly, and with the knowledge that they can't be used as punctuation, they will be fully read out by a screen reader. For accessibility purposes, but it means we need to use them for their point. We need to use them as a little decorative thing at the end of a tweet rather than throughout the content, making the actual content completely exclusionary to anyone who's using a screen reader. So my kind of final point is really about representation and who and what are you featuring in your content. So this is really key. We need to go beyond just describing the same people in all of our photos and describing kind of a really small group of people. We want to be fully representative, and we want to do that in an enabling rather than a disenabling way. So you may have heard the term inspiration porn, you may have not, but what that refers to is kind of a dramatic celebration of a disabled person doing something just because they're disabled. So an example could be, oh, it's so amazing that you're in a wheelchair and looking after your children. You're just living your life, you're just doing normal things, but it's being really pointed out to you that you are different. So really think about the words you're using and what the kind of coded language could be behind that. It can be tough to unlearn these things, but really if you think about that kind of concept of why am I drawing attention to this? This phrase, the only disability in life is a bad attitude, is a lovely example. That's just not true. Disabilities are real. So really think about that language and make sure that you are including everyone. And also use diverse graphics and images as well. There are some amazing resources out there in terms of stock images and illustrations and graphics that are largely free to use and make a massive difference to your content. So one of my absolute favorites is a small collection of images by a group called Affect the Verb. And they've released a kind of series of images called Disabled in Here, and they feature queer, trans, people of colour, disabled people in their photos, and they're just amazing photos that we should definitely be including in our content. There's also a resource called Black Illustrations, which has some amazing diverse illustrations, all featuring Black people. There's one called Liberty Pics, which is all about kind of LGBTQ people in the workplace and social. Anything you need is out there in a more diverse way than you might find on kind of a traditional stock image site. So I'll link some of my favorites down below, but just keep that in mind so you know that those options are out there and will make a big difference as well. So we're going to skip over this and we're going to think about what's next. So hopefully I've kind of opened your eyes to the fact that there are amazing options in terms of making really quick fixes to make your content more inclusive to everyone. The first step is to get practicing. So start writing your image descriptions, start including your alt text, start thinking about who you're including in your content, start thinking about captioning, do all of those things now. And be aware that that might take time and that it's okay to take that time to practice. There are some really useful resources out there that can act as reminders. So one of my favorite resources I found recently is a Twitter account called Alt Text Reminder. And it's a bot that will DM you every time you tweet an image without an image description. So that's the kind of thing we need to see more of. We need to see calling in people to remind them to make these accessible steps. We are always producing more content about accessible comms. It's one of the main things we love to do. So make sure you follow us on Twitter and on Instagram there, so you can kind of keep up to date with the latest changes to any of the social media platforms, so you know exactly kind of what's going on and how you can really kind of stay at the forefront of accessible comms. And we also do a lot of more in-depth support. So if you're thinking kind of, I don't know where to start, or you've got so much content out there and you don't know how to kind of work backwards and edit it, we can do a completely bespoke workshop. We can do accessibility audits on your entire website and all of your communications collateral to really make a difference and to know that everything that you have out there is fully inclusive and that you can reach a richer and more diverse audience because of that as well. And then if there are any questions you have or any ways that you think we might be able to help, or you want to find out more about the other workshops we offer, you can email us at workplace@diversityandability.com. And then, as I said at the beginning, it's the perfect way to end as well. I really do love talking about this. I love that these options are out there for all of us and that they're so easy to do. And that it is that kind of double-edged accessibility where we want the things to be easy for us to implement, and we also want them to open up to a new audience as well. So you can always drop me an email to ellie.thompson@diversityandability.com. I'm really happy to answer any questions you have, no matter how specific or niche, or point you in the right direction. So yeah, get in touch and we'll work together to make your content more inclusive as well. So if anyone does have any questions, I'd love to answer them. We can start a bit of discussion. But otherwise, you can always get in touch with us at a later date. And I'd love to speak to you then.
Amazing. Thank you, Ellie. That was, for someone who this is also really important to, but like I've learned so much of just really practical things, especially around the use of things and actually how that comes out. Like you sometimes aren't thinking about that, right? And thank you. It was some really practical things. I think also what's really feels really important is that this is ever changing, right? This is not just about, okay, let's look over our website once and that's just done. I think be able to kind of connect with you guys and be able to get that ongoing support of things that are shifting and how to ingrain that in everything you do, and keep our finger on the pulse around it seems really important as well. Brilliant. Yeah, thank you very much.